London sleeps uneasily when secrets walk beneath its trees. On a night when the fog lay thick upon the gardens of Kensington, a man of influence took his final steps, not in violence, not in fear, but in silence. I am Dr. John Watson, and this is the account of a case where death left no mark. And yet, Holmes saw everything. And should you wish to follow these accounts beyond this moment, you may also find them on Spotify. Chapter 1: The Midnight Discovery. The fog that settled upon London in the small hours of that October morning was of the particular sort which gives the city its reputation among travellers. A heavy, yellowing vapour that seemed less a weather than a presence, curling around lamp-posts, dulling the hooves of passing horses, and muffling even the bells of distant St. Mary's into something uncertain and far away. And I had slept badly. My old wound, that troublesome souvenir of Maiwand, had troubled me since the turning of the season, and I lay half dreaming in my room at Baker Street when the knock came at the street door below. It was not the polite knock of a client. It was the hammering of a man for whom decorum has been stripped away by urgency. I heard Mrs. Hudson's slippered tread upon the stairs, her muted protest, and then the firm, unhurried voice of my friend Sherlock Holmes, who had evidently not been to bed at all. When I descended some moments later, tying my dressing-gown at the waist, I found Inspector Lestrade standing upon the hearthrug in a state I had seldom witnessed. His overcoat was black with damp. His hat, which he had neglected to remove, dripped steadily upon our carpet, and his face, that sharp, ferret-like countenance I had come to know across a dozen curious cases, was drained of its usual colour, leaving only a grey and stricken mask. "Holmes," he said, and his voice was hoarse. "I have seen a great many dead men in my years at the Yard. I have never seen one like this." Holmes stood at the mantel, already dressed, a cold pipe clenched between his teeth. He had the appearance of a man who had been waiting patiently for precisely this summons, though he could not possibly have anticipated it. "Sit down, Lestrade, warm yourself, and tell me plainly, who is dead and where?" "Sir Alistair Wren," said Lestrade, "found an hour ago at the edge of the round pond in Kensington Gardens. The groundskeeper discovered him. Mr. Holmes, there is not a mark upon the man, not a bruise, not a scratch, and yet he is as dead as Julius Caesar." Holmes's grey eyes sharpened in that particular way I had learnt to recognise, the sudden, hawk-like focus of an intelligence fully engaged. "Sir Alistair Wren, the diplomat, engaged, I believe, in the French trade negotiations." "The very same. Watson, your coat. Lestrade, your cab is waiting, I trust." The drive to Kensington was conducted largely in silence. Holmes sat with his chin sunk upon his chest, his long fingers steepled before him, and only once did he speak, to observe, without looking up, that Lestrade's boots bore traces of the gravel particular to the broad walk, and that he had therefore approached the body from the northern gate. Lestrade, who had long ceased to be astonished by such trifles, merely grunted. The grey light of dawn was beginning to rise as we passed through the iron gates of the gardens, and the mist hung so thickly above the grass that the trees seemed to float upon a lake of vapour. A constable conducted us along the damp path, his lantern swinging, until we arrived at the open water of the round pond. It was there, at the pond's western edge, that Sir Alistair Wren lay. I have attended, in my years, to many scenes of violent death, but I confess that the composure of that body struck me with a strange and particular horror. He lay upon his side, one arm extended toward the water, the other folded beneath his chest as though he had simply chosen to rest. His face, turned toward the sky, bore no expression of terror or pain, only perhaps the faintest suggestion of surprise. He was fully dressed in evening clothes. His silk hat lay a yard distant upon the grass, undisturbed by any wind. There was no blood. There was no disorder of clothing. There was, to all appearances, nothing whatsoever the matter with Sir Alistair Wren, save for the inconvenient circumstance of his being dead. Some paces off, beneath the bare branches of a plane tree, stood the groundskeeper, a lean, weathered man of perhaps 50, whom Lestrade introduced as Thomas Reed. His lantern shook in his grip so violently that the light upon the grass danced like a living thing. His eyes would not meet Holmes's. "You found him, Mr. Reed?" Holmes asked, with a gentleness that I knew to be tactical. "At 20 minutes before 1, sir. I were walking my rounds. He were lying just so, sir, just as you see him. I didn't touch nothing. I ran for the constable." "Quite right. Kindly remain where you are." Holmes knelt beside the body. What followed I have witnessed perhaps 100 times, and yet it never ceases to strike me as a performance upon the very edge of the uncanny. He drew from his coat that small magnifying glass, which is his constant companion, and began his examination with the still, methodical absorption of a surgeon. He bent first to the face, then to the collar, then with sudden attention to the hands. He lifted the right hand, turned it palm upward in the lamplight, and held it so for several seconds. He passed the glass along the fingertips. He touched, very lightly, the cuff of the coat. He lifted the cuff of the shirt beneath and pressed his fingertip against the fabric at the wrist. Then, with an almost imperceptible intake of breath, he drew the victim's silver pocket watch from the waistcoat, pressed the stem, and studied the dial for a long moment. He rose, and he looked out across the black, still surface of the pond, and then down at the iron mooring ring set into the stone coping at the water's edge, a rusted relic, I supposed, from some forgotten era of pleasure boating. And his face, in that grey first light, was the face of a man who has heard, in the distance, the opening note of a symphony whose composer he has not yet identified, but whose hand he nevertheless recognises. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade. "Heart, I suppose. The poor devil was 58. His physician has been sent for." Holmes did not answer at once. He turned the watch in his palm. He looked again at the hand of the dead man. He looked at the mooring ring. And he looked at the wet grass, upon which the dew had lain undisturbed save at one small place near the stone coping, where it had been brushed aside, and where I now observed a single dried flower, such as a gentleman might wear in his buttonhole, lay crushed into the earth. At length he spoke, and his voice was very quiet. "Lestrade," he said, "this was no act of God. This was murder, executed with a precision I have rarely encountered. And whoever walked from this pond before dawn walked away believing he had committed the perfect crime." He slipped the watch into an envelope and the envelope into his pocket. "Come, Watson, we have a great deal to learn before breakfast, and very little time in which to learn it." Chapter 2, A Death Without Cause. We had not been 5 minutes returned to the pond's edge, considering the dew marks upon the grass, when a brougham drew up at the northern gate, and a tall, silver-haired gentleman descended with the unhurried dignity of a man accustomed to being waited upon. He carried a black medical bag. A constable conducted him along the path, and he approached the body with that professional composure which is the physician's armour against horror. "Dr. Malcolm Hargrove," murmured Lestrade at my elbow. "Family physician. Lady Wren sent for him directly." Hargrove was a man of perhaps 60, immaculately dressed, with the fine-boned features and pale, attentive eyes of a cultivated bedside manner. He greeted Lestrade with a grave nod, acknowledged Holmes with another, and offered me the particular courtesy one medical man extends to another. Then he knelt beside Sir Alistair. His examination was brief. He felt for the pulse at the throat. He lifted the eyelid with his thumb. He pressed his palm to the breast of the coat. He rose, removed his spectacles, and polished them upon a silk handkerchief. "Cardiac failure," he said. "I am sorry to say it surprises me less than it ought. Sir Alistair had been complaining of fatigue these past 3 weeks. I warned him against late walks in the damp. He was, as you know, an obstinate man." "No other possibility occurs to you, Doctor?" Holmes asked. Hargrove's pale eyes met his, and I observed that they did not flinch. "I have been Sir Alistair's physician for 11 years, Mr. Holmes. I know his heart, quite literally, better than he did. This is the death I have feared for him for 6 months. He spoke with the gentle regret of an old friend. Had I not known Holmes, had I not read in the particular stillness of his posture the depth of his scepticism, I should have accepted every word. Holmes said nothing at all. He inclined his head, as a man accepting a statement he intends, in his own time, to dismantle. An hour later, we were at the morgue in Paddington, where Sir Alistair had been conveyed. The attendant, a grey-faced fellow accustomed to eccentric visitors, withdrew at Holmes's request, and I was permitted, with the inspector's tacit blessing, to conduct my own examination alongside my friend. I will not weary the reader with the full catalogue. I shall say only this. I looked for every sign I had been trained in my years of service to look for, and I found none of them. There was no petechial hemorrhaging about the eyes, such as strangulation leaves. There was no cyanosis of the lips. There was no rigidity inconsistent with the interval since death. The skin bore no puncture, no contusion, no abrasion of any note, save at the fingertips, where, as Holmes had already observed, the skin was faintly roughened, as though the man had in his final instant gripped something coarse with considerable force. "Watson," said Holmes quietly, "bring the lamp nearer to the collar." I did so, and as I bent my head to the task, there reached my nostrils a faint, unmistakable scent, sweet, nutty, clinging to the fabric just beneath the knot of the cravat. "Almond," I said. "You are certain?" "I am certain." Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then he drew his glass from his pocket and bent over the dead man's right hand. He turned it as he had turned it beside the pond, so that the palm caught the yellow light. He touched the fingertips one by one. He looked with particular attention at the small hollow of the palm itself. "There is a case," he murmured, half to himself. "A case I pursued in Prague some years before you and I were acquainted, Watson. A young man of excellent family died in his bath. There was no water in his lungs. There was no wound upon him. The coroner pronounced natural causes. I did not." "What killed him?" "Electricity, Watson, galvanism. A current passed through his body by a mechanism he himself had never suspected." He lifted his glass. "The fingertips, in that case, bore precisely the roughening we observe here. Which is curious, is it not? For almond suggests cyanide, and cyanide suggests poison, and poison suggests a wholly different species of crime." He bent lower still. With the tip of his pocket-knife he worked at something in the hollow of the dead man's palm, something so small that I, standing at his shoulder with the lamp, could not at first perceive it. He extracted it with the care of a jeweller lifting a gem. He held it for an instant to the light. A flake, no larger than a grain of rice, dark and faintly metallic. He did not show it to Lestrade. He did not show it to me. He slipped it into a small envelope, sealed the flap with the pressure of his thumb, and placed the envelope in his pocket-book. "Holmes," I said, "you have an idea." "I have, Watson, a contradiction, which is considerably better. An idea may be mistaken. A contradiction must be resolved." He drew the sheet again over Sir Alistair's composed and untroubled face. A man with wet hands and dry sleeves. A watch that stopped at midnight. A scent of almond upon his collar, and no poison in his veins. He turned to me, and in the lamplight his grey eyes were very bright. "Someone, Watson, has gone to extraordinary trouble to tell us a story. It remains to determine whether we shall believe him." Chapter 3. Holmes declares murder. We returned to Baker Street in the pale middle of the morning, and I confess I was glad of the fire. Holmes, however, had no use for comforts. He flung his coat upon the settee, filled his black clay pipe with the coarse shag he reserved for his most difficult meditations, and began to pace the length of the sitting-room in that slow, deliberate manner which always preceded his clearest thought. Lestrade had accompanied us, reluctant and sceptical. "Mr. Holmes," he said, warming his hands at the grate, "I will speak plainly. There is no cause of death. The police surgeon will confirm what Dr. Hargrove has already stated. Without a wound, without a poison in the blood, without so much as a fibre out of place, I have no case to bring to any magistrate in England. You have 7 facts, Lestrade. I have 7 curiosities. That is not the same. Holmes stopped before the mantel and turned upon him with the quiet intensity of a man presenting evidence before an invisible jury. Consider them in their order. First, a man is found dead at the water's edge with his hands wet to the wrists, and yet the cuffs of his shirt, not half an inch above, are perfectly dry. A man who falls does not wet his hands in this manner. A man who kneels and reaches does. Second, upon those fingertips, an abrasion, faint, but unmistakable, consistent with the involuntary grip of a hand clenching upon something rough at the moment of a violent muscular spasm. A man may grip the earth in a heart attack, Lestrade objected. He may, but he does not in a heart attack stop his watch. Lestrade was silent. Third, Holmes continued, the pocket watch of Swiss manufacture in perfect condition when I examined it yesterday in his club. I had occasion to remark upon it, arrested at the stroke of 12, not wound down, not dropped, stopped. Fourth, upon the collar of the deceased a scent of almond so distinct that Watson, who has the nose of a physician rather than a chemist, identified it at once. Fifth, in the palm of the right hand, a fragment of metal so small that the mortuary attendant would have brushed it away as dust. He drew the small envelope from his pocket-book and laid it upon the table as one might lay down a trump card. Sixth, he said, upon the soles of the victim's boots, a species of mud which does not belong to any path a gentleman in evening dress would willingly tread. And seventh, crushed into the dew at the pond's edge, a single dried carnation of a variety I do not believe to be sold by any florist east of Regent Street. These are trifles, Mr. Holmes. They are the whole case, Lestrade. A man does not compose himself before dying. He does not dry his sleeves whilst wetting his hands. He does not stop his watch at the precise stroke of midnight as an act of courtesy to the investigating officer. Holmes struck a match with sudden sharpness. Sir Alistair Wren was murdered. The manner of his murder I do not yet possess, but murdered he was, and by a hand of uncommon cunning. Lestrade looked long into the fire. "If you are right," he said at last, "what then?" "Then we look for poison. The almond is the loudest voice in this chorus. Cyanide, administered in some refined preparation, perhaps by a person with medical standing, perhaps in the course of an ordinary evening's courtesy. We shall pursue it. We shall pursue it to its natural end." I glanced at my friend in some surprise, for there was a curious flatness in the manner in which he proposed this theory, as though he were laying a wager whose outcome he had already calculated. Lestrade, considerably cheered, took up his hat. "Poison I can investigate. Poison leaves traces. I shall instruct the police surgeon accordingly." "Do so," said Holmes. When the door had closed behind the inspector, I turned to my friend. "You sounded less than convinced by your own theory, Holmes." He smiled, that thin, private smile which I had come over the years to distrust profoundly. "My dear Watson, the almond on the collar is a very loud voice indeed. I have learnt to be wary of voices which shout. For the present, however, let Lestrade chase his poison. It will keep him occupied, and it will keep our murderer, whoever he is, confident that he has been understood." He reached for his hat. "Come, we shall begin with the widow." Chapter 4. The Circle of Suspects. The Wren residence stood in Eaton Square, one of those tall, pale-stoned houses whose dignity is founded as much upon the silence of its servants as upon the quality of its stone. We were admitted by a butler of such composure that one suspected he had been informed of his master's death by telegram, and had found the news less disturbing than a misplaced decanter. We were conducted to the drawing-room, where Lady Eleanor Wren rose to receive us. She was perhaps 34, a full quarter of a century her husband's junior, and she possessed that particular English beauty which survives grief by disdaining to acknowledge it. Her hair was drawn back severely. Her gown was black, but the black of a woman who had owned it for some time. She did not weep. She offered her hand to Holmes with the courtesy of a hostess receiving an awkward guest. "Mr. Holmes, the inspector has sent word that you are assisting. I shall answer what I can." "My condolences, Lady Wren." "Thank you." She resumed her seat and rang for tea. Her hand, as she took up the bell, trembled, not violently, but with the fine, continuous tremor of a wire drawn taut. I observed it. Holmes observed it. Whether Lady Eleanor observed it, I could not say. Holmes's questions were gentle and few. She had retired at 10. She had not waited for her husband. He had walked every night at 11:30 these 15 years, and she had long since ceased to mark his hours. They had dined separately. She had been alone in her boudoir with a novel until the police had come to the door at 1:30. "You were alone, Lady Wren?" "The servants retired at 11. I was alone, Mr. Holmes, as I am most evenings." The phrase was not spoken bitterly. It was spoken, rather, with the even inflection of a fact long accepted. Holmes thanked her, and we rose. At the door he paused. "Forgive me, one further trifle. Did Sir Alistair wear a boutonniere yesterday evening?" "He did not. He had not worn one for a fortnight. He complained the pins injured his lapels." In the cab, Holmes was silent for some minutes. Then he said, "She pours tea with a trembling hand, Watson, and speaks of her marriage in the past tense. One of those facts interest me. The other does not." We found Edward Blake in his chambers at the Foreign Office, a fair-haired man of perhaps 32, handsome in the fashion of a county cricketer, with the quick, unguarded manner of one who has never had occasion to learn guardedness. He received us civilly. He did not pretend to have liked Sir Alistair. "We quarrelled at the club last night, Mr. Holmes. I do not deny it. Over the French clauses. Sir Alistair favoured a concession I believe ruinous. Words were exchanged. I left at 10:15 and returned to the club by 1:30, where I remained until nearly 2. A dozen men will attest to it." "You are certain, Mr. Blake, that the quarrel concerned only the clauses?" A flush, very faint, very brief, passed across the young man's face. "The quarrel, Mr. Holmes, concerned the clauses. That is all I shall say." "Quite so," said Holmes mildly. "I shall not press you." We took our leave. In the hansom my friend remarked that Mr. Blake was a poor dissembler and a worse liar, but that he did not believe him to be a murderer. A man who flushes at a direct question, Watson, is rarely the man who has arranged a death. He has not the stomach for concealment. Thomas Reed we found in his hut beside the Italian Gardens, a small, damp structure smelling of paraffin and wet wool. He removed his cap at our entrance. His hands, I noted, were still unsteady. "The cloaked figure, Mr. Reed," said Holmes. "You spoke of him to the constable." "I seen him near the upper fountain, sir, about 11:15. I thought him a gentleman out walking. I did not approach him, sir." "You did not? It is your duty to approach strangers after dark. Is it not?" Reed's eyes dropped to the floor. I had my rounds, sir, further on." "Quite so," said Holmes, and asked nothing further. But as we walked back along the path, he murmured, "He lies, Watson, but he lies as a frightened man lies, to conceal, not to deceive. We shall return to him." We came last to Harley Street, where Dr. Malcolm Hargrove received us in a consulting room of immaculate order. A coal fire burned low. The bookshelves were handsomely bound. Upon the wall opposite the desk hung a framed photograph. Hargrove, some years younger, standing in a garden party with a carnation pinned to his lapel. He offered us tea. Holmes declined. Hargrove poured himself a cup, with a hand so steady it might have been carved. His answers were precise. He had attended Sir Alistair regularly these past 18 months. The diplomat's heart had been failing. He had warned him. He had expected, within a year, this very event. He was grieved by it, as any physician is grieved, and no more. "You are most helpful, Doctor," said Holmes. "One last question. Do you, in the course of your practice, Use any preparation containing almond oil. Hargrove smiled gently. A great many, Mr. Holmes. It is common in emollients. I apply one to my hands, an occupational vanity, I fear. A physician's hands are his calling card. Just so. Thank you. In the street, Holmes walked some paces in silence. Then he said, very quietly, 4 suspects, Watson. 4 secrets. But only one of them knows what killed Sir Alistair, and it is not the one we expect. Chapter 5. Clues that do not belong. Holmes was at my bedroom door before the sun had cleared the chimney pots. Your boots, Watson, the stout ones. We return to Kensington, and this time we shall have the light. The Gardens, in full morning, were a different country from the fog-bound theatre of the previous dawn. A nursemaid wheeled a perambulator along the broad walk. A retriever splashed in the long water. The round pond, stripped of its mist, lay innocent under a pale October sun, a sheet of grey glass bordered by raked gravel and weathered stone. Holmes went directly to the western coping where Sir Alistair had been found. He did not speak. He drew from his coat a small leather case which I knew to contain a hand lens, a steel rule, and 6 glass phials with cork stoppers. He knelt. For fully 20 minutes he worked along a strip of ground no more than 3 yards in length. He scraped a little mud from between the flagstones into one phial. He took a further sample from the grass above the coping. He examined the stone itself, running his glass along the waterline, pausing, returning, pausing again. When at last he rose, there was that subdued fire in his grey eyes which always meant that the hunt had found its scent. He led me then, not back toward the gate, but along the pond's edge, and thence by a narrow path through a belt of plane trees northward. The ground rose gently. After perhaps 10 minutes' walk, we emerged into the formal terraces of the Italian Gardens, with their ornamental basins and the great upper fountain crowned in pale stone. Holmes went directly to the fountain's western balustrade. He stood a moment, surveying the ground. Then he bent, very suddenly, and lifted from between 2 paving stones a small, dried, brownish object, which upon his open palm resolved itself into the crushed head of a carnation. He turned it with the tip of his forefinger. Dianthus caryophyllus, Watson, the grenadine variety, a French cultivar, not, I think, presently in the trade of any florist nearer than Covent Garden, and uncommon even there. He produced the twin from his pocket-book, the flower I'd seen him lift from the dew beside the body. He laid them side by side. They were unmistakably of the same stem. A boutonniere, I said. A boutonniere, Watson, dropped here, crushed there. Our man paused at this fountain. He stopped long enough to disturb the flower at his lapel. Holmes glanced about him with narrowed eyes. Why? What does a man do at a fountain in the dark at 11:15 that disturbs the pin upon his coat? He bends, he sets something down, he adjusts an object of some weight held close against his chest. He did not elaborate, he did not need to. We returned by the path we had come. Some 30 yards short of the round pond the path branched, the main way continuing to the water, a narrower track diverging eastward between laurels. A low iron chain and a small weathered placard barred the latter. Groundskeeping staff only. Holmes stepped over the chain without ceremony. I followed. The path ran perhaps 40 yards to a gate behind the service sheds, and thence, I perceived through the railings, directly to Kensington Road. He crouched. He took a 3rd sample of mud from a patch where the path softened beside a drain. He held the phial to the light, and against its 2 companions, that from the victim's boot sole, that from the flagstones at the water's edge, he compared colour, texture, and the small fragments of cinder which distinguished it from the common mud of the gravel walks. The same, Watson. In all 3 phials, the same. Our visitor entered by this path. He walked it in darkness. He passed the Italian Gardens, where he paused and disturbed his boutonniere. He continued to the pond, where he did his work. And when that work was done, he returned. I have very little doubt by the way he had come. He rose, dusting his hands. One further matter. He drew from his waistcoat the small envelope which had not left his person since Paddington. He tipped its contents into his palm, the metallic flake, no larger than a grain of rice, or dull and faintly reddish in the sun. He held it beside the iron mooring ring set into the coping some yards off. The colour of the flake and the colour of the corroded iron at the ring's base were, to my eye, indistinguishable. He gripped this ring in his dying instant, Watson. A flake of its corrosion remained in his hand. Holmes returned the fragment to its envelope with the care of a man handling a relic. He turned to face me, and his voice dropped. The man who killed Sir Alistair Wren walked from the Italian Gardens to the Round Pond. He did not come through the main gate. He came through the maintenance path, the one Thomas Reed claims to patrol. Chapter 6. A Walk Through the Gardens. We found Thomas Reed splitting kindling behind his hut. He rose at our approach and set down the axe with deliberate slowness, and as though laying down a weapon he knew would not protect him. "Mr. Reed," said Holmes pleasantly, "you will be so good as to accompany us a short distance." Reed's tongue passed over his lower lip. "I've work, sir. Your work, Mr. Reed, will keep. Come." He came. We walked him the 40 yards to the service gate, and there, at the mouth of the maintenance path, Holmes produced the 3 files and set them upon the low stone wall in a neat row. "This mud, Mr. Reed, is from the sole of Sir Alistair Wren's boot. This from the flagstones where he died, and this I lifted not 20 minutes ago from the very path upon which we stand. They are identical. They are the mud of a path you patrol, Mr. Reed, and which no gentleman in evening dress has any business upon." Reed's eyes fixed upon the files as a rabbit's eyes fix upon the muzzle of a terrier. "I never, sir, I never killed no one. I have not accused you. I have asked you to account for a path." The man's composure, such as it was, collapsed in a slow, ugly way as wet paper collapses. He sat down heavily upon the wall. He put his face into his hands. And then, in a voice broken by the shame of a poor man exposed, he told us the thing he had been sitting upon since the hour of the discovery. It had been 3 nights before the murder, he said. He had been at his supper in the hut, when a gentleman, tall, cloaked, his hat drawn low, had rapped at the window. The man did not show his face. He did not give his name. He had simply laid an envelope upon the sill and spoken some dozen words, that Mr. Reed was to take the long northern round upon the night of the 14th, after 11:30, and was to remain upon the northern round until past midnight, and that there would be a second envelope by the same window when the night of the 14th was done. And the envelope, Mr. Reed? 20 sovereigns, sir, in gold. I've a daughter, Mr. Holmes. She's been took very bad with the lungs, and the doctor—" He swallowed. "I never thought, sir, not murder. I thought it were one of them matters between gentlemen. An assignation, a duel, perhaps, but not— Did you see the man's face? His hands, his boots?" "Not his face, sir. Not clear. His voice were soft, a gentleman's voice. That is all I can say." "Was the second envelope delivered?" Reed nodded miserably. "The morning after. Slipped under the door. Another 20. I have not spent it, sir. It is in the tin, under my bed." Holmes regarded him a long moment. Then, to my surprise, he laid a hand briefly upon the groundskeeper's shoulder. "You have behaved badly, Mr. Reed, and you will answer for it in your own time. But you did not kill Sir Alistair Wren, and I shall so inform the inspector. Go back to your kindling. Speak of this conversation to no one." Reed looked up, incredulous, and then, very slowly, he nodded. As we walked back toward the gate, Holmes said quietly, "A small man, Watson, bribed by a larger plan. He is guilty of many things, but not of murder. The murderer is a gentleman's voice in the dark." We had arranged that Watson, which is to say myself, should call that afternoon upon Lady Eleanor, upon a pretext arranged by Holmes, the retrieval of certain papers which Sir Alistair was supposed to have mentioned at the club. The errand was a fiction, but plausible, and I was admitted to the morning room to wait, while a servant went in search of documents which did not exist. The servant sent was a young parlour-maid, perhaps 18, with the unguarded face of a girl who has not yet learnt that one's employers are not one's confidants. She returned after some minutes apologetic and flustered, and in the course of her apology she let fall, quite innocently, a sentence which I should not otherwise have heard. "Oh, sir, I am sorry to keep you. I thought perhaps Mr. Blake had borrowed them. He's been so often in the study of late." She checked herself. Her colour rose. She fled the room upon the thinnest of excuses. I did not press her. I did not need to. Holmes listened to my report at Baker Street in his customary posture, long legs stretched toward the fender, fingertips together, eyes half closed. I confess I expected from him some flash of vindicated triumph. A motive had emerged. A man who was often in the study of a married woman. A husband who stood between that man and his happiness. A husband now conveniently dead. Here, surely, was the shape of the thing. Holmes did not move. When I had finished, he said, without opening his eyes, "An affair, Watson, is a motive for scandal, but scandal is not murder." He paused. "Unless—" He did not finish the sentence. He rose, crossed to the window, and stood a long while looking down into Baker Street, where the lamplighter was beginning his slow progress from post to post. "Tomorrow," he said at last, "I shall tell Lestrade that I'm ready to name his poisoner. And we shall see, Watson, whether the man who arranged this crime is as clever as he believes himself to be." Chapter 7. The False Answer. Lestrade arrived at Baker Street the following morning in a state of barely concealed excitement. He had, he informed us, as he shed his overcoat, instructed the police surgeon to test for every preparation of cyanide known to modern chemistry. The results were expected by evening, and he had come, with the air of a man collecting a debt, to hear Mr. Holmes's promised theory. He was not disappointed. Holmes stood at the mantel and delivered his case with the cold precision of a barrister addressing a bench. The method Lestrade is poison, a refined cyanide compound, almond-derived volatile, administered in a preparation so small that no trace remains in the stomach, and yet sufficient to arrest the heart of a man already weakened. The scent upon the collar is its signature. The stopped watch is coincidence, a worn mainspring no more. The wet hands are the spasm of the dying man reaching for the water he could not drink. And the hand? He who administered the draught is a person of medical training, with regular access to the Wren household, and with knowledge of Sir Alistair's nightly habits. Dr. Malcolm Hargrove acting, I suspect, though I cannot yet prove, upon the solicitation of Lady Eleanor Wren and Mr. Edward Blake, whose association is of a nature I shall leave to the inspector's imagination. Lestrade struck his fist upon his knee. I knew it. The widow and the lover. It is always the widow and the lover, Mr. Holmes. A conspiracy of three. So it would appear. I shall have a warrant for Hargrove by noon, and the others before nightfall. I should be glad of it, said Holmes. When Lestrade had departed, clattering down the stairs with the enthusiasm of a man who has at last been handed a case that will look well in the newspapers, I turned to my friend in some bewilderment, for I had watched him during his own performance with the eye of long acquaintance, and I had seen no spark of conviction in him at all. Holmes, you cannot mean it. He did not answer at once. He crossed to the fire and stood gazing into it, his pipe cold in his hand, his face half in shadow. I mean every word of it, Watson, as a theory. I mean none of it as the truth. Then why? Because the theory is elegant, too elegant. A conspiracy of jealousy, a doctor's black bag, a widow's inheritance. It is precisely the tale a certain kind of mind would wish us to discover. It accounts for every surface. It accounts for nothing beneath. He turned from the fire. Consider, Watson, a cyanide victim does not die with dry sleeves and a stopped watch. He does not lie composed upon the grass as a man taking his rest. He convulses. He vomits. His skin reddens. His lips blue. Sir Alistair bore none of these marks. The almond is a door. Watson, but it opens upon an empty room. He worked that night in the chemistry corner, with a concentration I had learnt long ago not to disturb. He had taken, before we left the mortuary, a small scraping from the collar of the deceased, sealed in a glass slide, and this he now subjected to a battery of tests. Tests I did not fully understand, involving the application of certain reagents to the fabric beneath a spirit lamp's steady flame, and the observation of colours through a prism held against a white card. Twice he grunted, once he murmured something in German. Toward 3 a.m, I fell asleep in my chair. I woke to the grey dawn, and to Holmes standing over me with a faint, weary smile. "Well, Watson," he said, "our poison has evaporated." "What is it, then?" "It is almond oil. Common, cosmetic, perfectly harmless. The preparation sold at any chemist's in Harley Street for the softening of gentlemen's hands. I have tested the fabric against 3 reagents which cyanide, in any of its forms, must answer. The fabric is silent. There is no poison upon that collar, Watson. There never was." He sat down opposite me and filled his pipe. "Consider what this means. The scent was placed there. It was placed there by a man who wished us to conclude precisely what Lestrade has now concluded. A man who knew, as only a medical man knows, which scents the Yard would trust, and which theories a police surgeon would chase to the exclusion of all others. A man who, indeed, wrote such a treatise himself. I published, some years ago, a small monograph upon the scents a physician carries, which I now have some suspicion our adversary has read. Then the killer wished us to smell poison, Watson. He succeeded, but in succeeding he revealed himself. For only a man steeped in medicine would know which scents the Yard would trust. Only a man with access to Sir Alistair's wardrobe at some moment between his leaving the club and his entering the gardens could have placed the scent upon him. And only a man of sufficient coolness to do all this, while also performing the actual work of killing, by some means we have not yet named, deserves our fullest attention. He struck a match. Lestrade will have his warrant by noon. He will find Dr. Hargrove at home, composed, helpful, and entirely innocent of cyanide. And by the time Lestrade has finished apologizing, our doctor will know that we are closer than he believed. We must be quicker than that, Watson. Tonight I require your company at the Round Pond, and the loan of a certain piece of apparatus from a friend at the Royal Institution. Chapter 8. The Invisible Weapon. Holmes was absent the greater part of that day. He returned at dusk in a four-wheeler, accompanied by a wooden case bound in brass corners, which he and the driver carried between them up the 17 steps with the caution of men conveying gunpowder. "From a colleague of mine at the institution," Holmes said, setting the case upon the sitting-room floor. "A quiet man with an interest in wireless telegraphy, to whom I had occasion, some years ago, to render a small service. He has lent me what I required and asked no questions, which is, I have always maintained, the truest mark of a friend." He did not open the case. He merely indicated it with his pipe stem and remarked that we should dine early and sparingly. At 10:30 we took a cab to the northern gate of Kensington Gardens. The night was cold, without fog. A thin moon rode above the trees. Holmes produced a key. By what means obtained I did not inquire, and admitted us through a small postern which I had not previously observed. We carried the case between us along the maintenance path. At the coping of the Round Pond he set his burden down. "Keep the lantern shielded, Watson, and stand back from the water." He opened the case. Within, bedded in felt, lay a voltaic pile of some dozen cells, coupled in series by heavy copper strips, 2 lengths of insulated copper wire, each perhaps 20 feet long, a small brass bell of the sort employed in laboratory demonstrations, and a pair of india-rubber gloves. He drew on the gloves. He attached one terminal of the pile to one length of wire, and ran that wire along the flagstones to the rusted iron mooring ring which had occupied so much of his attention these 3 days past. He wound the bare end about the ring's base. He took the second wire, attached it to the opposing terminal, and paid it out into the water of the pond, weighting its end with a stone. Between the ring and the near end of the second wire, at a point where a man's hand might grip, he introduced the brass bell, wired into the circuit as a witness. He stepped back. "Wet your glove, Watson, then touch the ring." I did so. I reached with my dampened glove for the iron ring. The bell rang, sharply, a clean high note that carried across the still water and returned thinly. "I'm from the trees beyond." I drew my hand back as though scalded. Holmes was watching me with a small, grim satisfaction. "The circuit is complete, Watson. Through the ring, through your hand, through the ground upon which you stand, back through the water to the pile. You have just done, in miniature, and with harmless current, what Sir Alistair Wren did at the stroke of midnight 3 nights ago, save that the pile which killed him was of industrial magnitude, sufficient to stop the heart of a man before he could cry out." I looked at the ring. I looked at the black water. I looked at the composed iron and stone where a man had knelt and died. Good God, Holmes! He is a creature of habit, is our Sir Alistair, a man who walks this path at 11:30 nightly, who has done so these 15 years. The murderer knew it. He had only to arrange that on one particular night, at one particular hour, the diplomat should be induced to kneel, and to grip, and to complete the circuit. A silver cigarette case, Watson, I have little doubt of it, laid upon the flagstones beside the ring where the moonlight would catch it. Sir Alistair bends. He reaches with his left hand for the case. He steadies himself, as any man of his age steadies himself at a kneel, with his right hand upon the iron ring. His hands are wet with the dew of the grass he has crossed. The circuit closes. The current passes through him, through the ring, into the pond, to ground. He began methodically to draw in his wires. Death, Watson, is instantaneous. The heart stops as a watch stops when its mainspring is seized. The fingers clench, spasmodically, violently, and in clenching they roughen themselves upon the corroded iron and take away, unremarked, a flake of rust in the palm. The electromagnetic pulse of so powerful a discharge is sufficient, as I recalled from the Prague business, to derange the delicate balance of a pocket watch and to stop its mechanism at the instant of the charge. The sleeves remain dry, for the man has not fallen into the water. Only his hands, which gripped the conducting surface, are wet, and upon the grass beside him lies a composed and unmarked body, which any physician glancing at it in the dawn will pronounce, as Dr. Hargrove pronounced, the victim of a failing heart. He coiled the last of the wire. He closed the case. The cigarette case he retrieved, of course, when the work was done. The wires he drew up, the pile he lifted from the water, and he worked in perhaps 10 minutes, Watson, and was gone before the groundskeeper, done bribe to the northern round, had completed his first lap. He forgot only 2 things, a flake of rust which clung to a dying palm, and a carnation which fell from his lapel as he stooped over his apparatus at the upper fountain. He turned from the pond. "Now, Watson, we have the method, we have the motive in shadow. What we want is the man, and I believe I know where to find him." Chapter 9. The Reconstruction. Holmes sent his card to Harley Street the following morning with a note appended that Dr. Watson had of late been troubled by a curious complaint acquired, he believed, during his service in the East, and would welcome the opinion of a physician of Dr. Hargrove's standing. An appointment was returned by the afternoon post for 5 o'clock. "You will present, Watson, a set of symptoms I have devised for you upon the drive. Recurrent low fever, joint pain of a wandering character, a faint rash upon the trunk which obligingly comes and goes. He will press you upon particulars. You will oblige him at length. I require," Holmes glanced at his watch, "not less than 20 minutes of uninterrupted consultation. Can you furnish it?" "I can furnish an hour, Holmes, if the cause requires it." 20 minutes will suffice. We arrived at the appointed hour. Dr. Hargrove received us with his accustomed grave courtesy, and if he was surprised that Mr. Holmes should accompany his friend to a medical appointment, he was too perfect a professional to betray it. I was conducted to a small inner consulting room. Holmes remained in the study, I pleading the need to compose an urgent note and requesting the loan of pen, ink, and a quiet corner of the desk. I played my part, I believe, creditably. I described my symptoms with the circumstantial fluency of a man who has attended many patients afflicted with vague complaints, and Dr. Hargrove, to his credit, listened with attention, asked shrewd questions, and arrived by slow stages at a cautious tentative diagnosis involving a tropical spirochete. He had some literature upon it, he said. He would fetch it from the outer study. This I forestalled, with a second and more elaborate description of an attendant symptom I claimed to have forgotten, and which required particular attention to the state of my ankles. 20 minutes had become 25 before Hargrove at last rose and opened the door. I heard, from the study, the scrape of a chair as Holmes rose courteously from the desk. "I have trespassed upon your hospitality most shamelessly, Doctor. Forgive me. My note is finished." In the cab, bearing eastward toward Baker Street, Holmes at last permitted himself the thin, dry smile of a man who has found precisely what he expected. "He did not search his shelves, Watson. I did. And he did not, I fear, attend very carefully to his blotter." What was upon the shelves? A treatise upon galvanism, Watson. Bertoletti's Principles, the Milan edition of '86, bound in calf, and worn upon the spine as a volume is worn that has been consulted not once but 50 times. It stood between a Gray's Anatomy and a slender work upon tropical fevers, the latter, I shall add, uncut at the third signature. And the blotter? The blotter, Watson, bore the faint reversed impressions of a sketch made within the past week and hastily erased. I held it to the lamp as I rose to take my leave. I saw a circle, the ring, a line, the wire, a shape which could only be a rectangular cell or pile. He had drawn his own diagram, Watson, and pressed it into the paper beneath. At Baker Street, with the curtains drawn and the fire made up, Holmes at last assembled the whole narrative for me. It begins, Watson, some years ago. 4, I should think. Perhaps 5. Doctor. Hargrove has practised upon Harley Street for the better part of his professional life, and has acquired along the way the reputation, the address, and the expenses of a gentleman. He has not acquired the private fortune that would support them. Twice. In circumstances I shall not now describe, but which a study of the death registers will confirm, he has administered to wealthy elderly patients a quantity of morphine sufficient to ease their suffering by the simple expedient of ending their lives, and has received, from grateful widows anxious to avoid the scandal of protracted illness, sums of considerable generosity. The death certificates he signed were false. The crimes were invisible. He had, he believed, done what many physicians have done and will do, and he slept well. And Sir Alistair? Sir Alistair, Watson, was a diplomat, and diplomats are men who read diaries. One of those widows kept one. It came, upon her death last spring, into his hands. He read it, he understood, and he went to Dr. Hargrove. To denounce him? To use him? Here, Watson, is the particular cruelty of the thing. Sir Alistair had himself received, some 8 months ago, a diagnosis of a fatal nature, a malignancy of the liver, as I now believe, inoperable and of some months' prognosis. He wished it concealed. The French negotiations were at a critical turn. His removal would have collapsed them. He required a physician willing to attest that his health was sound. Dr. Hargrove, confronted with the diary, agreed. Each man held the other's ruin in his hand. They were, Watson, locked into the closest and most hateful of partnerships. Then what altered? Sir Alistair's conscience. He was, by all accounts, a religious man at the end. He was preparing a sealed letter, to be opened only upon his natural death, in which he intended to confess everything, his own concealment and the doctor's crimes. The letter had not yet been written. It was being composed, I suspect, in his head during precisely those midnight walks. Dr. Hargrove, who attended him weekly, learnt of its existence. He understood what it meant. He had, perhaps, a month, perhaps less. Holmes tapped the bowl of his pipe against the grate. The mud upon the service path, Hargrove entering, the carnation at the fountain, his pause to adjust his apparatus, the envelope to read, the northern round insured, the almond upon the collar, placed during his dawn examination of the body to lead us elsewhere, the flake of iron in the palm, the ring he himself had installed, the stopped watch, the current, the wet hands, the dry sleeves, the composed face, every clue Watson accounted for, every clue in its place. He rose and stretched his long arms above his head. "Tomorrow, Watson, we gather them all, and the doctor will confess, because I shall leave him no other path." Chapter 10. The Final Confession. The drawing-room of the Wren residence at 3 o'clock upon that grey October afternoon was, I think, the quietest room I have ever entered. A coal fire burned low in the grate. The heavy curtains had been half drawn against the fading light. Upon the Persian carpet stood 5 chairs, arranged by Holmes himself in a loose arc before the hearth, and in those chairs sat Lady Eleanor Wren, Mr. Edward Blake, Mr. Thomas Reed turning his cap in his hands, Inspector Lestrade stiff with official discomfort, and, at the farthest end, composed and faintly curious, Dr. Malcolm Hargrove. I stood at Holmes's shoulder by the fire. Holmes began without preamble. "I shall be brief. I shall be exact. I shall ask no question of any person here which I cannot myself answer. Lady Wren, your composure in these days has been remarkable. It has been read by some as the composure of guilt. It is not. It is the composure of a woman who long ago ceased to expect happiness from her marriage, and who is not hypocrite enough to affect a grief she does not feel. You did not kill your husband. You did not conspire in his killing. You knew nothing of it." Lady Eleanor did not speak. She inclined her head once. "Mr. Blake, your quarrel with Sir Alistair at the club was not over the French clauses, though you were gentleman enough to let the lie stand. It was over his wife, whom you have loved, I believe, with a sincerity that does you more credit than your discretion. You were at the club from 10:30 until nearly 2. A dozen witnesses will confirm it. You are guilty, Mr. Blake, of many things. Murder is not among them." Blake's colour rose. He said nothing. Lady Eleanor did not look at him. "Mr. Reed, you accepted 40 sovereigns from a man whose face you did not see, in exchange for walking the northern round upon a particular night. You are guilty of gross dereliction of duty and of a sin against the trust placed in you. You are not guilty of murder. The inspector shall determine in his own time what further consequence attaches to you." Reed bowed his head. "And the poison." Here Holmes turned half toward Lestrade. "The poison was never poison at all. The scent of almond upon the collar of Sir Alistair Wren was a cosmetic preparation, placed there in a moment, stolen from the dawn examination of the body, by a hand which had every professional reason to touch that collar unchallenged." He turned at last to Dr. Hargrove. The doctor sat perfectly still. He had not moved through any of what had gone before. His hands rested upon the arms of his chair. His pale eyes were fixed upon Holmes with a kind of patient, almost scholarly attention. "Doctor," said Holmes very quietly, "the method first. A voltaic pile of industrial construction concealed in a medical bag, carried by you along the maintenance path of Kensington Gardens upon the evening of the 14th. A wire run from the pile, submerged in the round pond, to an iron mooring ring which you had, at some earlier occasion, prepared for the purpose. A silver cigarette case laid upon the flagstones beside the ring as bait for a man who walked that path every night of his life. When Sir Alistair knelt to retrieve the case, his wet hand closed upon the ring. The circuit completed itself through his body. He died in an instant, without cry and without mark, save for the roughening of his fingertips, the stopping of his watch, and a flake of iron in his palm which you, in the haste of retrieving your apparatus, failed to observe. Hargrove's face did not alter. The motive second. 4 years ago, and again 2 years ago, you administered morphine in fatal quantity to 2 patients whose deaths enriched you by the gratitude of their heirs. Sir Alistair discovered this through a diary that came into his possession last spring. He did not denounce you. He bound you to him, requiring your medical silence regarding his own terminal illness, which he wished concealed until the French negotiations concluded. When you learnt, some weeks ago, that he was preparing a sealed confession to be opened upon his natural death, you understood that your silence could no longer be bought. You struck before the letter was written. Still Hargrove did not move. The mistake third. Upon the flagstones of the Italian Gardens, where you paused to adjust the apparatus in your bag, a carnation fell from your lapel. A Grenadin carnation, doctor. French bred, not commonly sold in England. I lifted its twin from the grass beside the body, and upon the wall of your own consulting room, in a photograph taken 3 summers ago at a garden party in Hampstead, you stand smiling with a Grenadin carnation pinned to your coat. You are, I have been informed, the only subscriber in London to the florist in Covent Garden who imports them. Hargrove closed his eyes. For a long moment the only sound in the room was the settling of coals in the grate. Then the doctor opened his eyes and rose and sat down again, the gesture of a man who has stood to leave and remembered at the threshold that there is no longer anywhere to go. He looked at his hands. He looked at the fire. When at last he spoke, his voice was low and even and unsurprised, as though he were concluding an argument he had long ago conducted with himself and lost. I had thought it perfect, Mr. Holmes. I had thought of the water, and of the wire, and of the ring. I had thought of the groundskeeper, and of the scent, and of the hour. I had thought of everything that might be observed. I had not thought that absence itself could be a clue. Lestrade rose. The arrest was made quietly without manacles in that same drawing-room. Hargrove walked between 2 constables to the waiting cab, as a man walks to a dull appointment he has no reason to postpone. At the door, Holmes paused and turned back. You sought a death without a mark, doctor. Yet you forgot. Absence itself leaves a trace. A watch that does not tick. A hand that is wet when it should be dry. A silence that speaks. The invisible, doctor, is rarely as invisible as its maker believes. And so ended the case of the midnight killing in Kensington Gardens, a crime of such cold ingenuity that I confess I did not sleep easily for many nights afterward. Holmes filed the papers away without comment, but as he turned down the gas that evening, and the small red glow of his pipe was the last light in the room, he remarked, "The most dangerous men, Watson, are those who believe themselves invisible. Well, let us be grateful they are so rarely as clever as they suppose."